Kyle, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Thank you. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Here.
Commissioner Fresco.
Here.
Commissioner Lambert.
Yes.
Commissioner McKinnon.
Present.
Commissioner Perry.
Here.
Chair Anderson.
Yes, here. Next on the agenda is the oath of office for reappointment of me, Amy Anderson, to the Planning Commission.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Amy Anderson,
I, Amy Anderson,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution
that I will support the Constitution
of the United States
of the United States
and the Constitution
and the Constitution
of the State of California,
of the State of California,
and that I will faithfully discharge
and I will faithfully discharge
the duties of the Planning Commission.
the duties of the Planning Commission.
Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, next is the Planning Director's report.
Thank you. And congratulations, Chair Anderson.
Thank you.
Kyle said you'd be on the commission until 2021. So that sounds like a very long time
I
to
know,
me. So,
I'm tired already.
Almost a life sentence, really.
so looking at the agendas going forward for the commission, August 2nd and August 16th. The second will be regular zoning ordinance policy discussion number 2, excuse me. And then on August 16th, we have 2 development agreements, 1430 Lincoln and 1325 6. So those are the 2 DAs that are related to the fire station project. And then a regular meeting on September 6th. And on that agenda, right at this point, we just have some CUPs and variances. And then the September 20th meeting, which will be the second regular meeting, is canceled. And Kyle is pulling to see if the 13th or 27th would be better for you guys. So I'll let you know once that is figured out. And then on City Council, so the 25th will be the final meeting on the DCP. As I'm sure you all know, they met last week on Monday and Tuesday, the 10th and 11th. They held a public hearing, had their deliberation on Tuesday night, and then took a series of straw votes and gave us direction on what to come back with in terms of ordinances to implement the votes that were taken on the 11th. So that's what we're doing. Those staff report that will go out, if staff report out tomorrow, and that will fully explain the actions or the votes taken so far, and then also the ordinances are attached to that. And then I see we have a question, but before we move on, I just want to introduce our new associate planner, James Combs. So this is James' first Planning Commission meeting, I believe. James came to us from Oxnard and has been here about 3 months. And then welcome, Tony came back from his European travels. I know you guys missed him at the last meeting, so and that concludes my report.
Great. Commissioner McKinnon, do you have a question?
I do. So August the 16th, there are 2 DAs. Are they going to be treated as one event because they are linked by this fire station, or they're 2 separate, although they are consequential on the fire?
2 separate addresses and 2 separate applications.
What happens if we reject one of them? That's an interesting.
Yeah.
I see. So it's not, although they're a result of one event, they are 2 separate decisions that we'll be making on that evening.
Yes.
Correct.
And if one project didn't happen to go through for whatever reason, then we'd reassess the arrangement with the
Right.
parking
Thank you.
and everything else.
Thank you so much.
Commissioner Lambert.
The July 25th City Council meeting is going to be a public hearing, correct?
Yes.
Is that limited to the inclusionary zoning issue?
I think it's limited to anything that was raised during the July 11th meeting. So, and whatever that may be, I don't think that we are intending to open it up entirely. On the other hand, if it is even arguable that something was raised on July 11th, I think the thought is to let people speak.
Well, the inclusionary thing happened on July 11th.
Correct.
And the public didn't
sure.
have a chance to give input or to read Paul's report,
Correct.
which
And
still
that's
isn't out.
clearly one thing that we do anticipate will be fully vetted on the 25th.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, next up is approval of the minutes.
Actually not.
Oh, what?
Planning Commissioner announcements.
Oh.
You skipped right over that
I
bit.
did. Commissioner McKinnon, do you have an announcement?
I do.
Great.
So I recently represented the City of Santa Monica at a national conference, Places for Bikes, invited by the Planning Department and staffed by City Council members and others. And there were 300 or 400 people from across the United States at that event. And what was quite striking was one of the other members, a commissioner from one of the other commissioners, said about halfway through, I thought we were doing a really great job on bikes and mobility in Santa Monica, but I see that we are being handed our position by other people. So that, I think, indicates that we need to have a renewed focus on mobility going forward. And for your benefit, that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the year. So that's number one. And number two, the zoning update that's coming, I had wanted to put on the, and give notice that I will move a 13 item, I guess, that an issue about administrative approvals for buildings on the boulevards that are 100% net zero or net zero environmental requirements. I will give you that notice. Do we fold that in to the discussion of the zoning update, or would we treat that as a separate item?
I believe that'd have to be a separate item. I'm just trying to remember. We just sent out the public notice, and the commission had gone through the process of identifying
And there were
what you were
various
going
buckets.
to.
All
Yeah,
right,
your various buckets.
So I'll give you
yeah,
advance warning and give you the notice, and we will.
yeah.
Obviously, we've got
But it
two
does
meetings.
sound like,
are two
regardless if
meetings
this
to
is a
discuss it,
new
yeah.
issue, then we had created that third bucket of new policy directions, and it was always the understanding the commission could add to that as time goes on. And I think
It is
we
as a
could-
consequence of the city council hearing on the downtown
Mhm.
plan that it's been arisen.
A quick question.
Mr. Lambert?
Was R1 development standards in the bucket, A bucket? I don't remember.
That's a separate
Separate thing.
process
And a big thing.
project that we're undertaking
Soon.
soon. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Now on to the minutes. So we have 4 sets of minutes before us, all covering DCP discussion. Is there a motion or is there comments about the minutes? Commissioner Perry?
Yeah, I have questions that I'm still looking into related to 6C, the May 11th meeting. So I will go ahead and move approval of 6A, B, and D.
Commissioner Fresco, do you want to turn on your microphone? Can I just, is there a second?
I had a comment about some minutes. So, B.
I would second then. Let's see, A and D, right? 'Cause you were
Yeah, A and D.
Okay, so before us is a motion to approve 6A, the minutes for 6A, April 26th, and 6D, May 17th. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, Commissioner Fresco, what are your...
On page 6, in the third paragraph about the 6B. The third paragraph about the sidewalk widths, setbacks, it's described a little cockamamie, and I just wanted to clarify it so it was correctly described. It's so that it says setbacks on 2nd between Santa Monica Boulevard and Broadway, and on 4th between Broadway and Wilshire is what we approved for 14 feet.
So is there a motion to approve the minutes of May 10th with those amendments?
So moved.
Commissioner Perry moved. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
aye.
Any opposition? Any abstention? Okay, so minutes of May 10th pass, and we'll hold over the minutes for May 11th. Okay. So moving on to public hearings and the consent calendar, item 8A, the CUP for 220 Broadway.
I move the consent calendar.
Second.
All in favor of approving the consent calendar?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Any abstentions? Okay, motion passes. So that means that the CUP for 220 Broadway has been approved, and there is a 14-day appeal period with regard to that approval. Well done, staff.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to a presentation from the Office of Sustainability and the Environment. Garrett Wong, welcome. Oh, thanks.
Anytime.
Good evening, Garrett Wong here from the Office of Sustainability and the Environment. I lead climate policy, energy projects, and programs. Tonight we're going to be discussing the Electric Vehicle Action Plan. I realize you don't have the actual plan before you yet. We're still working on the draft. But what we're going to be talking about tonight are basically the highlight and the overview of what we hope to be in the plan. And we're basically bringing forth to you the key concepts that we want you to consider and think about and provide comment on. So just to provide a little bit of background, Santa Monica's greenhouse gas emissions are largely from the vehicle sector. So getting to carbon neutrality is of key importance by removing the emission sources from the vehicle sector, obviously through electrification, as well as other alternative fueled vehicles. Obviously, mobility plays a big piece of this, and we'll talk about that later. But electric vehicles are going to be a big strategy in terms of being able to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. Some of you may know that California has some goals in terms of increasing zero-emission vehicles, which do include things like electric vehicles as well as alternative fuel vehicles like hydrogen. But they're hoping to increase overall sales and overall EVs on the road within less than a decade. So just to be clear about what is it that we are talking about, there are various types of new vehicles on the road, and they have different kinds of engines that operate that run on different kinds of fuels. So a hybrid vehicle is one that is fueled by gasoline. It's supplemented by an electric battery to help extend the range. A plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, or PHEV, is one that can take both gasoline and electricity, again, both to supplement each other's range. A full battery electric vehicle is one that relies solely on electricity for its fuel and for kinetic motion. And we're mostly focusing this policy on supporting the uptake of full battery electric vehicles. Per gallon, electricity is cheaper. It's more stable, and we'll show that on the next slide. But compared to the cost of fueling for gas, you're saving money when you're plugging in either at home, usually, even if you're paying a fee for charging when you're doing it so in public areas, it's typically cheaper. Gasoline has fluctuated very much over the years, continues to rise. Electricity has done so more steadily. When it comes to electric vehicles, growth is apparent, and we're seeing that more and more, especially as more types of vehicles become available on the market at for different market sectors. So the Bolt EV really significantly increased sales overall compared to last year. Obviously, we're anticipating the Tesla Model the Model 3 to increase EV drivers significantly as well. So there's lots of different kinds of fully electric vehicles for different kinds of market segments. Our vision and our goals for this EV action plan is really to ultimately achieve a decarbonized transportation system. We hope that that system is supported by a sophisticated network of chargers, but we want to make sure also that it's financially sustainable, there's equitable access, and that we synergize with modern technology. When it comes to our goals, at least our near-term goal, we're trying to hit almost building up our network to almost 300 chargers, and I'll show you where we are now in a moment, within less than 5 years. And we want to increase EV ownership locally to 15% by 2025, just as the state has indicated where it wants to go for California. As I mentioned, we recognize that the single occupancy vehicle, even a zero emission vehicle, still exists within a hierarchy of mobility. And we do want to recognize that walking and biking should be the preferred way of getting around, followed by low emission transit, and then perhaps shared mobility services, whether or not those are autonomous or electric, and then going to the single occupancy vehicle, which could be a zero emission vehicle, and then obviously the non-zero emission vehicle would be the last preference. So in Santa Monica, what we have seen is that our multifamily neighborhoods are less likely to go full electric. We see a lot of uptake in terms of hybrid electric, but we don't see full electric, and for many obvious reasons. The darker areas are indicating where there's a stronger uptake of full electric, and we also have data to show us where people are installing electric vehicle chargers, and those are typically follow the drivers as well. We have 75 public chargers currently available. We're working on more, and we'll talk about that later as well. There are challenges to EV adoption. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a very technical thing to pull off, and we're putting electricity and power where there wasn't really designed to accommodate that kind of need before. Our buildings are very old. Our sidewalks do not accommodate this kind of power demand on the street. So we're really building new infrastructure when we're talking about providing for electric vehicle charging. It's not as simple as running one wire from one building panel to a parking space. There's a lot that has to go into it. But when it comes to the specific sectors of public and private charging for the city, obviously we don't have enough chargers to meet the current demand right now. We know that's more anecdotally, but we also lack data. We have yet to have a real strategic focus when it comes to EV planning and projects. And so we don't have any sustainable source of funding. As I mentioned, projects to design and install and deploy these kinds of resources are very time intensive. And we also have kind of a spaghetti kind of structure internally when it comes to organizing this. If you can imagine, there are very many divisions and staff that have to get involved when you decide to locate an EV charger. You have the site host division, you have our parking office, you have our streets division, and then you have our facilities maintenance division, and you have our planners who might get involved if necessary, and then there's obviously the folks who would be designing and engineering and constructing it. So it does take a massive coordination to pull off some simple projects at times. When it comes to people who want to charge on their own, obviously there is a lack of off-street parking for people to do so. There is the obvious owner-renter split incentive. And then there's just the constraints of the building itself, where you're parking, whether that's located close to an electrical source, whether that electrical source is adequate enough to provide the level of charging that you need. And then there's just a general lack of awareness and education, because there's a lot of technology and there's a lot of change that's happening right now. There's a lot of options that people can do. So what I alluded to earlier was that, again, electric vehicle charging takes a lot of electrical infrastructure, and that can vary greatly. There's no real template to deploying this kind of stuff because you have to assess the site, and you have to assess the site as well as whatever's upstream of that site. Edison is not fully prepared to provide electric vehicle charging on every block. That's the bottom line. When we ask for these kinds of projects, they might have to upgrade the transformer, which is on a pole, which is in the alley, and then the pole has to get bigger, the transformer has to get bigger, the gauge of the wires that transmit the electricity have to get bigger. And then there's all sorts of undergrounding of electrical infrastructure that's involved. So it can become very costly before you actually get to the point of actually providing charging. So several years ago, staff had gone back to council in 2011 and discussed a lot of these issues to council. It was a study session. Unfortunately, a lot of the issues that were brought up then are still very much the same issues now. But we've been continually trying to promote electric vehicles and alternative vehicles through our AltCar Expo, and we do community presentations. Specifically for this plan, we've done a lot of research, a lot of literature review, a lot of interviews, a lot of meetings with folks who have done a lot of planning, our utility, representatives from the EV industry, and people who provide charging as a service. We've looked at other jurisdictions and what they are doing to promote EV charging and EV ownership. We've also consulted locally. We have a EV policy coalition. We also have our task force on the environment who we've gone back and forth with discussing a lot of these issues. And so what we've heard in our conversations is that we do want to focus on the positives. We do want to focus on promoting the benefits of EVs. Despite the challenges, they aren't insurmountable, but we do want to make sure that that going EV is an option for them. And then we want to make sure that they know how to do it and what are the benefits of doing so. We obviously we heard that EV charging is needed everywhere, and it's needed mostly in our multifamily neighborhoods. We're kind of behind the times when it comes to meeting the current demand that we already are experiencing. In order to continue promoting EVs, we recognize that charging should remain cheaper than gas. It should incentivize and reward drivers and people who would be considering becoming an EV driver. And we also want to recognize the societal and environmental benefits that EVs provide. Obviously, they're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They're a lot quieter. And they provide, again, a communal benefit. But as we manage this resource, we want to make sure it is a resource that is managed because there are, I won't say bad behavior, but there are people who tend to abuse the system by overstaying their welcome. And the Santa Monica's chargers are in high demand, so we need to make sure that we're able to rotate access for them. And we also need to make sure that if people have the ability to do so, that we should help them install chargers on their own properties. So we've divided our plan up into 4 priorities, and we'll talk about those priorities in terms of actions and recommendations that we're trying to make to kind of further this mission along. So when it comes to modernizing and expanding our public infrastructure, I need to explain a little bit of what we deal with already. So Santa Monica's EV infrastructure right now is some of it's 15 or 20 years old. It's essentially a fancy plug. There's no information or data that we get from it. We have no way of monitoring and tracking any usage. We don't know if they're broken. And so we rely on our EV community to let us know when there's something that needs to be fixed. And again, we have no way of enforcing good behavior when it comes to utilizing the asset. So smart chargers are essentially the new best practice when it comes to this kind of technology. Smart chargers do have all those kinds of functions. They're able to track and report. We're able to track our electricity usage, track our costs. We're able to create parameters for each individual charger, so that way they can align with the parking limits or the site hours if they are limited to a certain time of day. We can also create pricing signals if we want to incentivize people to leave or perhaps charge at a certain time. We can even create user groups to create a user group for our city fleet or create a user group for our residents. And then there's obviously other benefits when it comes to the users in terms of being able to find and locate and reserve their space and get notified when they're exceeding their limit or meeting their limit. So this is what we're hoping to do, and we think this is going to be the more sustainable way to expand our infrastructure, because we want to establish a clean, new interface and model that we can continue to expand rather than going at it roughshod with various types of technology and different experiences across the city. What it does, it gives us more functionality, as I mentioned, and what we would be recommending also is considering a fee structure for charging. Currently it is free at this point, but we will talk about that at a later moment. Another thing that's available to us once we have a smart charger is the ability to capture what's called the low carbon fuel standard. This is something that's managed by the California Air Resources Board. They're trying to incentivize they're trying to decrease the carbon intensity of vehicle fuels. And the way that they do that is similar to cap and trade. They will give you a monetary benefit if you have a low carbon intensive fuel, then they will charge you if you have a high carbon intensive fuel. So people who are oil refineries, auto dealers and automakers, people who emit a lot of emissions as a result of their vehicles have to pay for these kinds of credits. That's why Tesla is making bank off of selling their electric vehicles, because all they do are low carbon fueled vehicles. If we are supplying electricity and we track that, we report it, we're able to monetize that and try and turn that into a revenue stream and help keep our operation costs low. We also want to look at other technologies like DC fast charging, battery storage, and solar to help offset costs. DC fast charging could help us provide a greater level of service in a shorter amount of time. And then we also want to look at other e-mobility options like e-bikes and neighborhood electric vehicles, because we know people are trending more towards some of these other kinds of mobility modes. And we don't actually really have a good resource for them if they're out in the public and needing a charge. So I mentioned some of the smart charging benefits and features. This is kind of to illuminate what they are for each segment. So the city, again, has greater sophistication when it comes to management. The user also has a different way of communicating and interacting with each individual charger and the whole network once they are smart and you're able to access them through a web app or your smartphone and things like that. So just for a little bit of discussion on cost recovery, it's not a discussion that's isolated here in Santa Monica. It's something that is happening throughout the state. So across California, of the public agencies that do charge or that do provide EV charging, the majority of them do charge a fee. We've looked at what are their rates, and we've looked at what is the greatest, what is the most prevalent kind of rate structure. And so we see that most jurisdictions charge based on per kilowatt hour, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Different vehicles charge at different rates. When you get a vehicle, they'll tell you the size of the battery, and that kind of tells you how quickly it can charge. And so a Tesla will charge differently than a Bolt, or a Bolt will charge differently from a Leaf. So by charging per kilowatt hour, it recognizes kind of that inequity between vehicles versus some places that might charge per hour. You're going to get less of a charge throughout that hour. So we do want to make sure that when we design it, that we're designing it to be more equitable in that regard. And then again, this is to kind of illustrate how different vehicles charge differently within the 1 hour. So while we're asking for council to give us the authority to implement a fee schedule, it's not going to happen overnight. When we transition to smart chargers, we'll have the ability to monitor and analyze the usage. We will be able to propose fee schedules, and we'll vet them with our users to make sure that they feel that it's a comfortable range, that will still be an incentive. And then we'll ultimately have to come back to council for approval of that fee structure. Even though a fee structure may be approved later on down the line, it doesn't mean that it's set in stone. Electricity prices change from year to year, and our demand costs change from year to year. So it may be appropriate to adjust these to recognize some of those changes over time. But we think once we at least have the authority to implement a fee schedule, that it will take some time before we actually implement it, due to the community outreach that we want to ensure. So the second priority is to facilitate EV charging in multi-unit dwellings and workplaces. We really do want to focus and make sure that there is an equity lens when it comes to implementing these kinds of programs. Obviously, people who are on lower income spectrum do not have the same kind of privileges and ability to procure EVs and charge their cars in their own dwellings. So we want to look at in ways that we can encourage and promote EVs and EV charging for them. We think that a pilot rebate program with a special incentive for low-income folks could help do that. We want to look at streamlining the market a little bit and streamlining the procurement process for some people who have a lot of confusion when it comes to all these options. So maybe pre-qualifying certain vendors, providing more of a marketplace for people to vet their options and understand what are the merits and the trade-offs when it comes to different kinds of technologies and different systems. We need to streamline our permitting process. I believe that is something that is going to be enforced through the state under a legislative bill. We also want to designate off-street and on-street locations for public charging. Currently, our municipal code doesn't allow the planning director to designate on-street parking for charging, but we want to make that change in the municipal code to make sure that that authority is there. We want to look at unique ways of providing more charging through in the neighborhood. So one of the ways that we think we can do that is by looking at our streetlights as a potential resource for EV charging. It's being done currently in the city of Los Angeles, and other communities are looking at that as well. We've done a scan of what are the available funding resources or what are funding resources that we anticipate coming, and we've kind of looked at who has access. I'm not really going to explain all of them, but I think you can get from the picture that, it's the person who owns their property that has the most access when it comes to these funding resources. So we want to design something that will be appropriate for those who have less access when it comes to the funding resources that are available. So again, as EVs are part of a larger mobility picture, we want to make sure that we're updating our parking policies and practices so that way there's not only efficient use of our charging stations, but there's also efficient use of other assets like our parking infrastructure. EVs don't necessarily displace vehicles, they just make them cleaner. So again, we talked about designated on-street parking for EV charging. We want to also update our zoning ordinance so that way the minimum requirement for EV charging per 25, per 50 parking spaces is increased. We also want to consider eliminating free parking at the meters and when that's applicable. Again, right now, EVs represent somewhere between 3 and 5% of all vehicles on the road. If within the next few years, if that increases to somewhere of 10 and 15%, those EVs will still need to park at a meter. And so the need to adjust our policy with free metered parking, I think, will have to reflect appropriately what are those changes in the market, as well as what are the other benefits that we're providing in the community when it comes to more free more EV charging and more resources for people to be able to charge in designated spots. We need to standardize some of our time and place restrictions. We kind of have a hodgepodge of signage out there. We also want to look at perhaps nighttime parking rates. If someone needs to park overnight and just wants to charge, maybe they don't have to pay the full day fee. We also want to look at designating parking spaces for car share, EV car share. So there's obviously Wave Cars you're aware of, there's the Free Ride, and there's Zipcar, but none of them have invested in electrical infrastructure. None of them are charging on city streets and city spots. They don't have a place to go other than their home base. So if we can create a greater resource for the community to access car share vehicles that are electric, we should do so. And we also want to expand our fleet sharing system within our city departments and divisions, because we do have a lot of EV vehicles parked at the Civic Center parking structure and the Civic Center lot, and it's creating a lot of congestion and a lot of competition for the chargers that are available right now. Our last priority is to develop outreach programs and resources. Again, there's a lot of information and misinformation that's out there. There's a lot of old understanding that people might have. They ask us, am I going to lose a lot of money by charging my car, my home, or maybe they've gotten. Sorry, I'll stop my thought there. But anyhow, there's again the understanding that people have when it comes to EV charging is mixed. You're not always going to buy an electric vehicle and an electric vehicle charger, so we want to help people along the way in terms of helping them and get that installed in their property. So obviously it starts with where it's easiest is through our webpage, so making sure that those resources are readily available. We have a program, it's called Solar Santa Monica, and we help people go through the solar procurement process. Again, that's kind of one of those very one-off, very technical purchases that you're going to make once in your lifetime. And we help people go through that process. And we think a program, maybe it's called EV Santa Monica, maybe something catchier, but a similar program would be useful. We want to look at facilitating car sharing, EV car sharing for low-income individuals. And we'd also like to create an EV coordinator. Similar to how we have a bike share coordinator, there are a lot of projects that we're asking for, and there's a lot of programs and policies that need to get implemented. And this is only a fraction of my time. And so we really need to dedicate our resources to this effort if this is something that the city is going to be serious about. So I'm going to transition a little bit into our infrastructure plan, and it's going to be, we're looking at a 5-year infrastructure plan in terms of what we think we can get done within that period of time. And when it comes to prioritizing, what we're looking for are our multifamily neighborhoods. We also want to look at where do we actually still have off-street parking that doesn't have charging. And then our next priority will be looking at where on-street can we put a charger and where can we put it that makes the most sense. This location here has a Chevron parking, so if we put one charger there and it has 2 charging cords, we could serve 2 spots. It wouldn't be as efficient if we did that for a parallel parking spot, but it's something that we're also considering. And there's obviously challenges that I spoke about, like the power might not be available, it might be just not feasible, or perhaps maybe the neighborhood just doesn't want it. So just to give you a frame of reference, this is where our existing chargers are. And again, we have a total of 75. And this is those by address and name. We have a round of new installations happening, and those are marked in yellow. The ones in purple are going through a special utility programs called Charge Ready. Hopefully, council will approve next week the selection of that vendor to move forward with that installation. But those are where we're hoping to site the next round of installations. And those are listed here. So from 75 available charging ports, if you add 34, we'll be well over 100 by the end of the year. And so these are those Edison Charge Ready locations that we're looking to electrify. So the remaining off-street locations that we have available for charging are marked in orange. Those are mostly our libraries and our parks. Okay, and so now we're going to talk about curbside locations. So when it comes to curbside locations, we try to find places that are, again, either head-in parking or chevron parking that might have a good chance of having an available electric source nearby. And so those are the ones that are marked in turquoise. And then there's our street lights, and these are where we think those might be, where we might be able to put them in. So again, over 5 years, we hope to reach almost a full network of 292 chargers. We've done some rough estimates around what the cost might be to get that done. We think it'll be just under $2 million over that 5-year period. And we recognize that there are a lot of funds available that are non-city funds that we could potentially leverage. There's a lot of grants. There's Edison. There's the Air Resources Board, the Energy Commission. We also have potential new revenue streams from charging user fees, from perhaps advertising, as well as our own revolving loan fund, which is a fund that we use when we get energy efficiency rebates to pay for these kinds of projects. Oh, and there's also the low carbon fuel standard credits, and then also potentially community choice aggregation, but that's a little bit further down the line. So some of our immediate next steps and what we hope to proceed on is installing new chargers at the charge-ready sites. We're hoping to move forward with retrofitting our existing chargers to smart chargers. We then do want to monitor usage, determine what would be our appropriate fee schedule once, if council approves that concept. Track the low carbon fuel standard, see how much that brings in terms of revenue, and then look at other ways that we can create a sustainable source of funding that can help continue to expand our charging network and sustain our operations and maintain our new community programs for EVs. So we're here before you tonight. It's been a long road up until this point, and it will continue to be a road ahead of us. Again, what we hope to come back to with is the actual draft of the plan. We hope to release that sometime in August for public review. And once we've come back to this commission and our task force on the environment and gone through whatever changes and comments that we need to incorporate, then we hope to go to council hopefully sometime in October. And I believe that's the end of my presentation.
Garrett, thank you so much. Super informative. We have a handful of members of the public who are interested in speaking, so why don't we take the public comment and then we can pepper Garrett with questions. So if you, I'll call 3 names if you would line up on your left to facilitate speaking. First will be Amy Bishop Dunbar, to be followed by Kelly Olson and Paul Scott.
Hi, thank you very much. This is my first time speaking before the Planning Commission, but just to give you a bit of background, I'm a 30-year resident of Santa Monica. I've seen a lot of transformation, and I've been involved in advocating and on commissions before, the Commission on Status of Women. One of the things that I think is really important for the Task Force on the Environment is to look at the economic corridors that are being evaluated for the electric vehicle sites. I live at 29th in Kansas, which is the east end of near Pico Boulevard. I walk there. Many of the stats that indicate electric vehicle permits or such are in that Sunset Park area, those are also walkers. They're not driving their vehicles to charge at a commercial location, but the commercial corridor of Pico is very vital to the city. It includes the 30,000 students that are using the college, and each of the businesses. There's about probably 15 businesses in each block, about 70 employees per block on each side. So you have to think about what it might mean for the employers to utilize or have permits for off-site sites, and then also for the customers, the friends that come to visit my home will want to take advantage of the electrical vehicles charging stations in some nearby area, and then we have a nice night out. We also have formerly Stewart Park, Gandahara Park, and Ishihara Park. That's also an area that should probably include some of the vehicle charging stations. I know it's just odd to see the potential locations as mid-city when the economic corridors are kind of Pico and Lincoln, and I think that needs to be evaluated. Thank you.
Thank you. Kelly Olson.
Excuse me. Good evening, commissioners. Kelly Olson, 60-year resident of Santa Monica, former chairman of the Planning Commission, former Santa Monica City Councilman, and initiator of the Santa Monica Alternative Fuel Vehicle Policy. I live in a multi-family building with no parking. I drive an electric car. I'm also a co-chair of the Santa Monica EV Policy Coalition. We agree with some of the things that staff has said and discussed here, and disagree probably with about an equal amount. First off, it's 1.5 million cars that the state is looking, and that Santa Monica City Council members, many of them have signed on to bring to California in 7.5 years. 1.5 million, we have 300,000. We will never reach that mark unless we aggressively do things to facilitate electric vehicles. Every time somebody feels, and I'm not meant here, don't mean to guilt trip anybody or make anybody feel guilty about what they do in their personal life, but anybody who uses a gasoline car for their personal transportation, the American Lung Association has a study that says that each 16-gallon tank of gasoline creates $18.45 in damage in health cost and environmental damage in the state of California, which equals $15 billion a year in California, which is a tremendous amount of damage. So what we want to see is these numbers of 400 in 5 years. Right now we believe 400 today. We need 400 EV chargers in Santa Monica today. In 5 years, we will need 1,000 chargers. People who want to have electric vehicles like me, nobody would go through what I go through. I would actually say you had to be an idiot to do what I do, to charge my electric car in Santa Monica. It used to be easier a couple of years ago. The city has made it more difficult in the past couple of years to charge an electric car if you live in a multifamily building. What we would like to see is we do support the position of a EV overseer who's dedicated for this, because things are going too slow. We have an RFP that was out 2.5 years ago. It's 2 years behind schedule to put 22 chargers in. None of those chargers are working. There's only 4 in the ground, and the power's not turned on for those. So we need somebody who can dog these things. We also would like to see a electric vehicle commission, because there are many issues that are complicated, as you've seen, decisions to be made, and the City Council should be advised about what policies to take forward, and having a commission, just as a planning commission, a task force on the environment, would be an appropriate way to do that. I just cannot overstate that I'll finish this up, but we do not believe that the fees that are being thought about are viable, because it will make driving an electric car more expensive than driving a gasoline car. And if we do that, nobody is going to drive an electric car in this community.
Commissioner McKinnon has a question for you.
I have a series of questions. So what do you now have to do to charge your car then?
Well, when I first got the car, it's a Nissan Leaf, 24 kilowatt battery. It would do 90 to 100 miles, depending on how efficient you are. And I was very efficient because I couldn't, readily charge at home. So I live in Princeton and Santa Monica. Virginia Park is an hour and 1.5 miles from me. So I would drive my car to Virginia Park, but there are so many people circling like sharks for the 4 chargers that are there that during the daytime, it's very difficult to get. So I discovered that late at night, very late at night, 11, 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, the demand wasn't as high, but there were still people charging, but I could usually find a charger. So I would take the car there at 12 o'clock, I'll leave it there till 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm a night person, walk over there at 3:30 and get the car. And that was working out pretty well. I did that about 3 to 4 times a week. The city decided that they didn't want this to happen. And they turned off 2 of the chargers, kept 2 of them on, so we were still able to do that. Then the city decided they didn't want us to do that, even though it was good for the grid, it was good for the community. And they stopped us from doing that. And one unfortunate incident, I would say unfortunate, it was premeditated. One electric vehicle driver who was charging at 5 minutes after 11 when allegedly the park was closed. My contention it wasn't, since I was the initiator of the park closure law, which talked about the parks, not the parking lot. He was arrested violently by a police officer, which resulted in a lawsuit, and $2.1 million was paid to this young man and his attorney, which could have funded about 300 or 400 chargers. So to answer your question, now I have to do a lot of hunting, and it's very difficult. That's what I'm saying. Nobody in their right mind would do what I do.
And is that the case for everyone who has an electric car?
Who lives in a multifamily building without parking.
Which is a substantial part of the mid-city area, which is where...
Yes, which is about 30% of our population. Yeah, and we had asked the City Council to draft a law that would make it so that if somebody who had a parking space, which I don't, at least that they could force the landlord to install infrastructure if they paid for it, paid for the electricity bill, paid for the installation and all of that. The city and staff, in its wisdom, decided to wait and said that they wanted to see what other communities were going to do before they passed such a law, even though it's been cleared through rent control. And while waiting, what we've got is a state law now which bans Santa Monica and any other city with rent control from passing such an ordinance. So we're working on trying to overturn that. But it's still difficult. So people like me, when a lot of people are, because as you know, the parking standards from the 1950s and 60s and 70s, my building has 7 units and has 3 parking spaces. I don't have one of them. So if we're going to try to get people to do the right thing, we've got to facilitate them being able to provide. And right now, these things that the staff is talking about, they're going to the visitors area. They're going to the beach lots and to the areas where we're going to have to pay $10 to drive to the south beach lot to use one of the 12 chargers, and then whatever the cost is.
So
going to charge.
in essence, you're saying there's some disparity between where people want to use them and where the proposed charges are going in, and there's some issues with pricing. That's summing up your argument. All right, thank you.
Yes, that's it.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Yeah, you said that the pricing that is being discussed would make driving an electric car more expensive than driving a gas car. That tells us you have some price that you've heard of, or there's some
Well, we saw some of the pricing that was in that chart right there. And we've heard anywhere from 25 cents a kilowatt to 50 cents a kilowatt.
That's a big spread, though. But both of those would make you not be
once you, and then they're going to have to charge the administration fees, and whoever ChargePoint or whoever does that, they charge the next thing on top of that, and then there's a transaction.
So what is the price that would be equal to a gasoline car?
Equal to the actual gas price, because you have to remember that an electric car is still, I pay $312 a month for my car, which is a $170 gas car. Mm-hmm. So I'm paying more. So if you factor that in, then, what we're suggesting is cost to the city of what the electricity is. And we get a pretty favorable rate, somewhere around 6 or 7 cents per kilowatt. Even if they did 10 cents per kilowatt, that's probably a fair amount. But anything over that, then people are just going to walk away, because you could buy a Prius. And for that amount of money, you could go twice the distance with less hassle than I could go in an electric car. That's why we need to incentivize this. And we're saving, you know, the environmental costs, the health damages, and not polluting the bay with the oil that drips out, and all the other things that we're, you know, helping. We're contributors, and right now we feel like we're the enemy in some regard. Not totally, but in some regard, like we're the bad guy. We had one staff member who said, we don't give free gasoline away. Why should we give any free electricity away? Well, there's a big difference about those two things, and that we contribute. A gas car does not contribute to this community. An electric vehicle contributes to this community.
Thank you.
Can I ask you one question too? Do you see a need or a benefit to use, oh, sorry, Commissioner Perry, to use the fee pricing in a way to manage use of the chargers?
Yes, to get people to move on.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that clearly is something that we do need, because I do see people that opportunity charge, that they may have a charger at home and they find a spot and they'll leave their car, or if they go to work, they may leave their car there too long. Sure, people in the EV world, they are not angels. When we first started out, when it was the zealots and the activists who had cars, like Paul, you know, for 13 or 14 years ago, everybody played fair. Now that it's in the mass populace, you know, people take advantage. You'll see a Tesla parked in an EV spot without being charged. Usually, it's no offense to Tesla drivers, I'd love to have one, fabulous cars, but disproportionately, they're Tesla people. Okay. And absolutely, using mechanisms to move people on is correct. It's just, where do you accommodate people and not make it so that, now if I'm paying twice the amount a month, why am I going to pay the same amount for the, you know, a higher amount for electricity that I would pay if I was at home?
Commissioner Perry has a question for you too.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Olson, for your comments and for all the extra effort you go into to be a zero emission driver. Could you tell us more about the EV Policy Coalition? Okay,
this is a group of people. Paul's one of them. Of Santa Monica residents, some are not Santa Monica residents, but they all are people who have electric vehicles. Some are co-founders of Plug in America, which is the world's largest nonprofit EV advocacy organization, which has offices in Los Angeles, sponsors worldwide now a National Drive Electric Week, where hundreds of thousands of people in September are exposed to electric cars. We have events here, we have it in Santa Monica, parades. And so everybody who's involved in this group has an electric car, and we have about, the 5 co-chairs have 75 years of driving experience. I mean, people have had cars 25 years, and when, you know, they went and got conversions years ago. So the first person, Bob Selden, who is a Santa Monica resident, who gave me a ride when I was a planning commissioner in an EV1 on Heon. So that's the group of people. We're very knowledgeable, experienced with EVs, all have EVs, and either live in Santa Monica or immediately adjacent, and people who have laid their lives down on the line for this. And have you ever seen Who Killed the Electric Car? Many people, some of them, Alexandra Paul is one of the people that was arrested trying to stop the EV1s for being crushed, and she's a member of our group.
And it sounds like you guys have been engaged in discussions with staff on the formulation of the plan.
We have, you know, Garrett and Dean, I think, are great people, and I think their hearts are in the right place, and I think they believe that, you know, this is the right thing to do. How we get there is not always in agreement. But
you guys are sharing ideas, even if you don't agree.
We've been told what the plans were, and we've had a couple of meetings where we said, this is what we're doing. We haven't, and we've told them what we thought about that, but we haven't really been able to incorporate or have any of our ideas incorporate. And then we just find out from things at the last minute, like we just found out about a Charge Ready program, you know, the past couple of weeks, and that they're going to be in a parking lot at the beach, which you're going to pay $10. Now, I live at Princeton. I'm not going to drive all the way down to the South Park Beach parking lot and pay $10 to park, and then to get my electricity. It doesn't work out for us. So we haven't had that kind of interaction that we wish we could. That's why we want a commission.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Paul Scott, to be followed by Judy Abdo and Paul Rosenstein.
Thank you very much for having me speak here. I just want a really quick raise of hands. Would you raise your hand if you do not drive a gasoline burning car? Okay. Okay, 2. Okay, that's good. I'm sorry? Okay, that's all I'm asking. If you don't, sorry. So 2 out of the 9. Well, this is good. Yeah, the worst thing most Americans do in their entire life, unless you've murdered somebody or were texting and killed an entire family, the worst thing you do is your cumulative use of dirty energy for your whole life. That's the use of dirty electricity in your home and oil as your transportation fuel. Now, as a child, you had no control over that. And as a young adult, you had no control because there was no option. But today there's an option. Edison and LADWP both offer 100% green energy options. So you can just call them up, go online, and in 2 minutes, your home is now running on clean energy. Electric cars have been available for over 6 years, affordable electric cars. You can buy a used Leaf for $5,000. This is why people who live in multifamily, who generally drive lower priced cars, would love to have access to those cars, but they don't because of AB 2565, the Al-Mursachi law passed in September of 14, that allowed apartment dwellers to install a charger in the state of California unless, there was a 15-word line in there, unless you're a rent control person, then you have no rights. You cannot use your electricity that you pay for to power your home, your clean electricity, because you switched, because you wanted to be good. You can't use that same electricity to power your car. They will not let you. So we need hundreds. I mean, Kelly was right. We need hundreds of these chargers as soon as possible so that these people who want to do good, who want to stop causing harm to other people by burning gas and spewing the poison into the air that all of us breathe, they want to stop funding Trump and the Republicans, because every time you buy dirty kilowatt hour, every time you buy a gallon of gasoline, all of the political money that the oil companies, coal companies, and gas companies provide goes to Trump and his team. So we want to stop doing that. All of our friends want to stop doing that, but they don't have access to the electricity. We need more of these chargers as quickly as we can get them, and we need them in places where people in multifamily can use them, a lot of people. And that's really all I have to say.
Thank you. Judy Epto.
Hello. I've had an EV for about a month.
Congratulations.
So I'm here with the sort of newbie feedback. And I agree with some of the staff report. I agree with some of what Kelly and Paul just said, but not everything. First of all, I agree that there should be incentives to encourage people to have EVs, and that should be looked at more globally, not just look at chargers, but what is it that we in Santa Monica can do to communicate to people who live here that it would be a good thing for them and that they would like it if they had an EV. There are some things that need to be fixed, like tomorrow. There are not notices on the chargers that don't work. So if they're broken, you find out because you plug in and your car says not charging. Or you look on a map and it says coming soon. Doesn't say when, but it looks like it works, only it doesn't. And that's really annoying when you're trying to plan your life around when you're going to charge. So I think somebody should go around all the chargers, there aren't that many, and just see if they work every day. Put a sign on them, out of order, fix it, that kind of stuff. I think the chargers should have directions on them. Some of them I think you're supposed to push a button, and some of them you just plug it in, and there are different makes and models. You don't know what to do if you're new at it. I think that they need to think about people who are driving through the city and need a quick charge on their way to San Diego or on their way to somewhere. When you want to go to a place where we have a charger, right now it's free, you still have to pay for the parking. And you're not there because you want to park. You're there because you need a charge. So you're paying whatever the going rate is, let's say on a Thursday night, $25 to park for 4 hours to get a charge, but you didn't want to be parked. You wanted to just get charged. So that, I think that's an anomaly. I think that all the infrastructure should be upgraded well before there's any kind of charging for the electricity. And if there is to be a charge, I'm not sure there should be, it should only cover maintenance costs, not cover infrastructure improvements. I don't think that's fair. We don't charge people, gasoline car drivers, to fix gas stations. That, it just doesn't work that way. I have a couple more things if anybody asks me questions.
Yes, what are those things that you were wanting to mention to us?
I think the free meters are a real big incentive, but I don't know for sure. I have a handicap plate, so it doesn't affect me. But I think some surveying or something should be done, because if it's a huge incentive to get an EV, then let's leave it on there for a little while longer. I understand why we'd want to change, but I think that it's important to have EV staff. I think it's really important to educate people who are thinking about buying an electric vehicle, and there ought to be a way for the city to communicate with them, and maybe there should be user groups beside that strong advocacy group, but just kind of an education group. I think those are my things.
Great, thank you. Any questions? Great, thank you, Judy.
Okay.
Paul Rosenstein.
Good evening. Of the four of us you're hearing from tonight, there's two people that have been here at this a while, and I guess two of us are new to this. I also just bought an electric vehicle a few weeks ago, so I'm beginning to learn about all the pluses and minuses of being able to operate an electric vehicle. So much of what I heard here I agree with, and I think people made some very good points that we have to be thinking about in developing this policy. And just thinking about the building I live in, it's a 1950 multifamily building, a few parking spaces in the back, but not enough for the 8 units there, because in those days, I guess, not everybody had a car, or 2 cars or 3 cars or whatever they have these days. But we have a very limited electrical supply. So it means to be able to charge these cars efficiently, we'd have to upgrade our electrical infrastructure in the building. And it's not quite as simple as just dropping a few heavier wires down from the electric pole, or adding a few new electric panels, which we probably would have to do, because we have an undergrounding law in Santa Monica, which means that any new electrical service or change to it has to be done underground. So we'd have to dig up the concrete we have and go about 20 feet or 30 feet to an electric pole, and then go up that, which is in the alley. And I'd say in 300 or 400 years with this policy, we'll be able to do away with these electric poles in the alleys. So, but it is an ordinance that adds a considerable amount to the expense of trying to improve the electric supply in older buildings. But at any rate, I just wanted to encourage you to move forward. I think you probably all know that electric vehicles time has really come. In the next couple of years, there's going to be a flood of new electric vehicles on the market. And the kind of concerns you heard expressed this evening will multiply dramatically in the next few years as people electrify. Thank you.
Paul.
Commissioner McKinnon has a question.
So I'm hearing from both you and Ms. Abdo that as new owners, enthusiastic owners, you're actually finding the practical difficulties of owning a car quite tough. Is that right?
Well, it's a new way of thinking. Instead of worrying if you're in the desert where the next gas station is, you have to think about how you'll be able to manage on the charge that you have, where you're going and where the nearest charges are. And there are apps that tell you that, although you have to combine a few different apps to get them all. But it is a new way of thinking that I'm going to have to get adjusted to.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, math and app. Yeah, thank you.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Yeah, you give us a nice example of a 5-unit building.
8-unit.
8-unit building with 5 spaces, right?
Yeah, about that.
And if you kind of were to opine, just a hypothetical, if you were to upgrade that building so that all 5 spaces would be able to charge at some reasonable rate, what would be an estimated cost for that?
I have no idea.
Okay.
As I say, we'd have to upgrade our electrical panels, and we'd have to bring a much heavier supply of electricity from the pole, which again would involve tearing up the concrete and going underground to the pole.
Okay. Well,
so
anyway,
I don't know what the
I'll
numbers
ask,
are.
I'll
I haven't
ask
got
the
that
staff.
far yet. Okay.
I would love.
Yes, you need to come up to them. Could you just state your name again, too, please?
Yes, this is Paul Scott again. Thank you. So the cost can be pretty high if you were going to go with the 240 for every space, 240 volt, but that's not necessary. Most people, the vast majority of them, as a matter of fact, of commuters, would only need 120 volt service. And that could be taken off of your existing apartment or condo's panel and run to your parking space without adding any new infrastructure to virtually any of the buildings in Santa Monica. It would still cost you a few $100s to run the conduit to where you park. That's if it's a reasonably easy one. There are some situations where you'd have to cut concrete or asphalt, which would drive the cost up dramatically, and it may not be feasible for those. But quite a few of them could be done with a simple 120 volt plug. That's what I use.
What's the trade-off when you go from 120, or the advantage of going to 240?
So it's a slower charge.
Right.
So you get home from work, say 7 o'clock, you plug in.
Is it twice the time? Is it 3 times the time?
It's probably 3 to 4 times the length of time. But here's the thing. If you drove to work and back and you drove 40 miles, you'd be fully charged by like 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
So if you drove 50 miles, maybe it'd be fully charged by 7 when you're ready to go.
At the 120, you're saying?
At the 120,
right,
correct.
Okay.
And so for most people, they don't drive any more than that in a day. Now, if they do, they may require a 240 or access to charging at work, which a lot of people can get.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Paul. All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight and providing that input. Appreciate it. All right. Wow. Are there questions or feedback for staff about the staff report and the proposed plan? Commissioner Fonda Bernardi, why don't you start, please?
Where do we start? It feels like Trump. It's more complicated than I thought. I thought we could just plug and go, but I have a number of questions for staff. So let's start with the low-hanging fruit. It seems that a public charging station costs about $10,000. Is that an accurate assessment? I mean, looking at your numbers, that's what they're running. Okay.
That would be a fair assessment.
Okay.
To be on the safe side.
And that's a 240 installation?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And can you tell us what the private equivalent would cost? And let's just start with a single-family home, hypothetical single-family home. If someone came to you and said, I have this house,
right.
I want to charge my car at 240, what would be a typical installation cost?
A few $100s.
Okay.
A couple $100 because you're mostly pulling. People tend to pull from their electrical dryer, which is 240.
Right.
And then they just pull it out to the garage. And then a charger can be just a couple $100.
Right.
And that can be pretty simple.
And then the same object, 240, in a typical Dingbat apartment building like the one our former mayor lives in, what would that run typically with the undergrounding and all that stuff?
That could probably be closer to $5,000 to $15,000.
Okay. And roughly of that 5 to 15,000, how much would that be? Again, typical situation, nothing special, no big distances, no short distance. How much of that is the undergrounding cost? Supposing we said, hypothetically, in an ordinance saying if you're doing it to upgrade for electrical and you had to provide it for all the spaces, you would be exempt from the underground ordinance or requirement, let's say.
So this is just kind of a demonstrative example, and you can see the charging equipment itself can literally just be the tip of the iceberg. And it starts from number 2 and number 3, where you can be, again, upping those costs. So there's no such thing as typical,
No,
unfortunately.
I understand that. What
because
I'm
each
really
building is unique.
I'm really getting at is the underground utility is something that we as planning commissioners might have some control over
see.
and a way of incentivizing, because if you're just doing it to charge a car, you shouldn't pay, $30,000 or $50,000 to tear up your alley. You get the secondary benefit that the power lines disappear because someone wanted to charge their car.
Right.
But it also means that a typical building owner would not go down that road is the real problem. And so 30% of our residents would be disincentivized. They just can never catch up.
Sure. So the numbers that we have here are actually taken from a study that UCLA did for the South Bay COG. And they took an electrician out to, I think it was about 20 or so multifamily units. And a lot of them look like Santa Monica multifamily units. And so this is the range of costs that they had encountered given their building. And so you can see, depending on the conduit and the trenching situation, surface conduit will be a few $100s, but trenching will cost you an order of a few thousand.
Right. Okay, so that's one set of questions. The other set of questions has to do with the utilization by the city itself. How many of the city vehicles are electrified at this moment, and how many might be in the same time frame that we're talking about?
Right. I think I have that in your staff, or maybe not in the staff report. I'm sorry. So we have, I want to say, somewhere between 115 to 130 electric vehicles in the fleet.
And how many total cars do we have?
Maybe about 500 to 600 sedans, like the kinds that would be eligible, I think, for electric vehicles. And so a majority of them are situated here in the Civic Center area. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of congestion that's happening here, particularly in the structure. So we've tried to do some quick fixes. We've located some of those 110, 120 volt outlets that Paul was talking about up to the second story. And we've dedicated those for nighttime charging just for the city fleet. They're available in the daytime, but we have on the first floor 14 charging ports available. Those are level 2, that 240 volt. And so we're trying to make sure that those are designated for public charging as much as possible. And just to comment on the issue with the Edison program and the charging sites that we've identified, one was the beach lot and one is the Civic Center structure roof. And the reason for that was because Edison's program is a pilot program, and the pilot program offers us an opportunity to get a lot of this infrastructure, a lot of this very expensive infrastructure for free, designed, constructed, permitted for free, provided that we buy the charging units at the very end, and then we operate and maintain them. And per Edison's program requirements, we have to designate at least 10 spaces for charging. So we don't have too many sites throughout the city that we can just cut off 10 spaces just for EV charging, let alone once we get up to that number, we're actually having to start to dedicate ADA spaces now for EV charging. And we can't designate existing ADA spaces. We actually have to create new ADA spaces. So there's a lot of space constraints as this program has been designed. I think Edison's taking a lot of that feedback from that program to lower the minimum requirements, and we hope to see that come back around with a lower threshold, which won't have all those complications. And
so charge ready means it's a turnkey operation. They build a whole system and say it's yours.
Correct.
And then you can choose whether to charge or not for it. Okay. So, there was some testimony to the effect that the rates that you charge have a lot to do with how feasible it is for people to do it. And there was a suggestion that $10 a kilowatt might be a starting point for a high level of penetration and absorption. what do you think of the other third cities that are charging that are not giving it for free? They seem to be considerably off the charts as far as that number. They're like, 5 times that number. And do we have any feedback with how that number impacts the penetration of EV cars? In other words, how do we price? What's the take home from that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I couldn't say because we haven't spoken to all of them. What we did was we took a lot of data from what's known as the Alternative Fuels Data Center, which is managed by the Department of Energy, and they poll us and they poll all sorts of people, and they say, like, what do you have in your community? Do you have a hydrogen station? Do you have a natural gas station? Do you have a biodiesel station? Do you have an electric vehicle station? What are the rules and parameters that you set, and what's the access that you give people? So that's how we get all that information. I think one thing that is demonstrative of the way that those pricing policies work and the way that it impacts the user base is, Santa Monica has a very strong EV population. We've grown, I think, at a greater rate than what the rest of the region and what the rest of the state has done. I think San Jose is one of the other areas, San Jose, San Francisco, the usual kind of cities that you would expect to have a high adoption rate as well. I think we have yet to do that kind of comparison to see, what is there a correlation between pricing policy and uptake? I think what we also see that there are other communities and public agencies that are less resourced to provide public charging for free, because it is, again, a significant cost to put it in there, and they do want to recognize the cost that they have to keep it up.
Okay, so let's look at the other end. Let's look at the supply end. You suggested in one of your bullet points there might be a limitation on the available electricity. And if you looked at the world from Edison's point of view, and we're, quadrupling, quintupling the number of EV cars, can they provide the juice when we need it? In other words, what's the demand profile night and day? Right. And can you give us some direction on that?
Yes. So Paul mentioned something that EV charging is a good thing for the grid, or maybe it was Kelly, but what we're experiencing today across the utility and across California is what's known as a duck curve. So, and that refers to the load profile throughout the day for electrical demand. So in the morning, we see a peak of use as people are doing their morning thing and getting ready for work. When people actually go to work, our electricity use goes down. And the reason why it goes down is because we're actually producing a lot of energy from solar. And you might have heard lately that we've been curtailing solar because we're actually producing more than we're using in the middle of the day. And then what happens is between 4 to 7 o'clock, we see a huge peak of electrical demand. People are going home. They're turning on their dishwashers, they're washing clothes, they're cooking, they're doing all sorts of activities, watching TV, and that creates a huge demand of electricity. And that's a lot of electricity that Edison is challenged to provide. And so what we'll see in the future is that cost of electricity will become more costly to use. What EVs can do is they can help balance this out, so there's less of a differential between middle of the day and the end of the day. They can help balance out the middle of the day by plugging in the middle, plugging in between, let's say, 9 and 4. Currently, the pricing structure is not really, the electrical rate structure is not designed for that because it's still more expensive right now, but it will soon be shifting to that afternoon peak and late and early evening peak. With regard to the electrical grid itself, the power line concept here that you see, we are served by what's known as 4 kV line, and that refers to kilovolts. And so there's a certain gauge of wire that conveys that kind of electricity. Where Edison is in the process of upgrading to what's known as 16 kV. And so that's a huge increase from where we are now. And we have 16 kV in a fraction of the community. I would say probably less than a quarter of Santa Monica's has 16 kV. And so if we are going to this future where essentially there's a charger on every block, there's a battery storage system in every building, there's a solar system on every rooftop, Edison will eventually need to upgrade everything to 16 kV. Unfortunately, the way that Edison does it right now is they only do it upon request. And if our project is in an area that's underserved by Edison, then we're ultimately going to be responsible for that utility upgrade. Edison is not doing this in advance of anything. They don't want to sink infrastructure where they don't think there's going to be demand, or, so they're not doing it in advance of what we are forecasting and what we want. It's mostly the tail wagging the dog.
So those 200 odd stations that you say are coming online, how do those square up with the availability of power? And what is the upgrading of the grid included in the $10,000 per station?
Yeah, so most of those locations are not currently prepared to be served by what's available right now. And we are trying to, as best as possible, forecast what that cost could be. So a single charger could be upwards of $10,000 to $15,000, which is much more expensive than just pulling power from one of our buildings into the parking lot, which would be somewhere between $3,000 and $6,000, let's say.
So given what we know of the profile and the availability of power, to meet our goals of cutting our overall consumption, if you could get 100 charging stations or 100 private installed locations, which would bring us closer?
Closer to
meeting our goals. In other words, how many public charging stations are equal to one private charging station? That's the question I'm really asking.
Well,
because I can buy a private charging location typically in a single family home for $300. In a multifamily home, maybe it costs me $5,000, and in the public it costs me $10,000. And so I need to make a choice there as to where do we get the most,
put our resources?
Where do we get the most leverage, basically?
Yeah. It will most likely be public charging, or it will be private charging where people can use that one space, or it's not deed restricted, or it's dedicated to one resident. And the reason is that if you think of a public charger will serve somewhere between 2 to 4 to 5 vehicles in a day. If you go to one single charger dedicated to one resident, that's all you're serving, right?
Right, but the point being that's a $300 expense. Here's a $10,000 expense. So,
if we're spending money, let's say through a rebate program, and we're also doing infrastructure at the same time, our money would still be better spent doing more public infrastructure per let's say driver served. But that said, we don't, everyone should have I wouldn't say charging is a right, but everyone should have a right to be able to charge, if that makes sense. Like, we shouldn't say you're going to have to go all the way to Virginia Avenue Park in the middle of the night to get your charge. That's not the options that we want to provide people. We want to provide people the most convenient option, and it should be within where they live.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Frisco.
I have a much smaller question, but I'm just trying to understand this idea of private homes or apartment owners putting their own EV chargers on the street and how that works. I mean, does that mean they pay for it and it's connected to their house and then their neighbor hogs their spot all the time and uses their charger? How does that work?
We're not recommending that policy. There is a lot of guerrilla charging happening, I'll say, where you see the extension cord running out the window and across the street and through the parkway. We have gotten requests for people to say, like, I'll pay for it. I'll put it out, put a charger on there, and anyone can come by and use it. But really, I think it would, if we were to let anyone put a something in the parkway, it would become as colorful as the parkway already is. And we'd have all sorts of issues in terms of, well, this is in front of my building, but you're parked here and you're parked here all the time. And, you know, like, how do we manage that relationship within a neighborhood? And so we do want to be in the neighborhood with public chargers. We want to be able to manage them with our, you know, smart enabled communicating chargers that are able to set certain parameters for usage, to price people out when they've overstayed their limit, and to make sure that there's a fair and equitable access of the resource. But I don't think we're going to see a future where people are installing their own chargers in the parkway.
I see. So that whole program was meant to be all public.
Correct.
Okay, that's good. I had a couple other questions too. Now I can't find them. What about just the fact that technology moves forward so quickly, and, you know, how are these, I mean, this may be too fine grained, but the idea that you're putting in these units that cost so much money, and, you know, how are we thinking about how they can be unscrewed in the new parts for the wireless charging?
Right, right. Yeah, so there are a lot of advances in the way vehicles charge and the way chargers charge. So, you know, one way that we've seen that you can mitigate the need to upgrade your building panel is by what's known as power sharing. So the charger itself can sense what is the capacity in the building, who's using power right now, and how much can I get away with providing charging to someone right now. If someone else parks and plugs in also, maybe I can split that power and we don't exceed the total capacity of the building. That's one way you can do it. And then you reference the wireless charging. So even if wireless charging becomes something where it's more popular, you know, that's where the market goes, we're still going to need the electrical infrastructure to get the power to that location.
Right.
So again, the most important thing that we're investing in is actually the electrical grid and our ability to bring power to those locations that where we want it. Wireless charging will not convey power to that space if there's no wires for it to ultimately get there. And there's huge amounts of losses to convey power by wire, as well as you know, through airwaves. So there's an even greater factor of loss when you transmit it without any conductive connection.
Beautiful. And just one last small comment, but that image you have on the front of your presentation, really not a nice image. A little aggressive, maybe.
Sure.
Something that makes you feel a little warmer and fuzzier. I mean, it was really alarming.
Okay. A smiling EV driver.
That would be better.
Commissioner McKinnon. Commissioner Perrin.
Thank you. So if did I understand correctly, the priority is, or one of the priorities is to provide options within the multifamily districts. So is the plan laying out a strategy for achieving that?
Yes. So,
and I asked the question with the, you know, seems like the existing constraint where the customer that may want the charging facility doesn't own the property.
Right. So part of that obviously is involved, you know, part of the barrier is cost. You know, people don't want to outlay investment or provide new benefits to someone that they're in the end not going to get any additional revenue from through increased rent. Our rent control board has passed a law that says if two people, an owner and a tenant, mutually agree that the tenant installs a charger, they can do so with their own monies, and they need to take out, you know, a liability policy, and they can have a side agreement actually to accommodate the cost of, you know, maybe that electrical charger is tied to the common area and not going straight back to the unit meter. So maybe they have a side arrangement, or maybe the building owner, in their benevolence, decides to do this investment, and they say, all right, well, now I'll just charge you $15 a month to recoup the cost. That can happen. But one of the ways that we want to provide more incentive into the mix is by providing a local rebate, specifically for these kinds of issues. And we want to make sure that we're not just going to be serving one person at the end of the day. We want to make sure that the benefit's going to extend to multiple people. So if you're upgrading the building panel, don't just upgrade it just for one new charger, upgrade it for 5. If you're running conduit for one parking spot, don't stop there, go all the way to the end. So we want to make sure that we're providing targeted incentives to incentivize the building owner to say this is going to be an investment in your property. Potentially you can get an upgraded building panel out of it. There's all sorts of benefits that you can get once you go down that path. You can look at solar, you can look at energy storage and things like that. But that won't happen until that investment takes place. So we're trying to target that decision point.
And is there also within the multifamily neighborhoods a strategy for curbside charging? So it's there's the on-site private property option, and then on residential streets having spaces that are dedicated for charging.
Right. So that's where we envision, again, this kind of distribution happening. They are in multifamily neighborhoods, and we're trying to look at, again, where is power, where are our street lights, where are the chevron spots, where are the head-in spots that make sense. And then, of last resort, let's go to the parallel park spots. But we are focusing at providing public charging in residential neighborhoods as well.
And so, and the trade-off there, or is it a trade-off that you're losing on parking options if you are not looking to charge your vehicle?
That will be a trade-off.
And I guess there's an idea, there could be an idea out there that, if it's regularly being used, it's in that spot instead of some other spot. And so it's netting out, but
right. EVs are replacing non-EVs. They're not reducing the total number of cars on the road, right? They still need to park too.
And are there any ideas for, if I understood you correctly, you were, the strategy was to encourage property owners, apartment building owners, to make upgrades through rebates, and that those upgrades serve multiple people. Is that picturing just multiple people that live on that site, or that could potentially serve people who do not live on that site?
Well, we're mostly thinking about the parking spots that are on site. So that would open up let's say a can of worms when you start to bring in non-residents on site. That would be a decision by each property owner.
Right. I'm wondering if this is an idea that has been looked into, because obviously business owners are looking for opportunities to increase revenues. And if there is an opportunity based on the configuration of the site for a property owner to provide this service to the community and receive some payback on it, some profit on it.
Sure.
Is that something that's been looked into? Is that something that's been tried?
Yeah. So I think one of the ideas that we had, and maybe I can ask our city attorney about the viability of it, is this kind of idea of like an adopt a charger kind of program, to say, like, if you sponsor, if you pony up $10,000, $15,000, that helps us get power to the curb. Maybe it could, one of the, as I alluded to earlier, the challenge of getting power is, again, if we're putting it in the public right of way, the city doesn't have a lot of options of where it can come from. But if there is a business there, maybe the electrical room is close enough to the street. Maybe they have an existing panel, existing capacity. Is it possible that we can put a secondary meter, run conduit from the building to the street, and now we have a charger that's sponsored by Pete's Coffee, you know.
Or a parking space in an apartment building that is not rented out to someone to park. It is dedicated for charging, and the owners receive payment for the charging on.
So it becomes a new revenue operation as a parking charging facility.
That's right.
If someone were to be so bold, all the power to them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's a policy or a program we would want to encourage.
I don't think so.
You mean because of? I mean, you wouldn't want to encourage it because why? Like, what's the?
I think one of the maybe because when people think about parking spaces in residential, obviously there's a distinction between some of our older rent-controlled properties in the city and the new construction ones. And obviously with the new ones, they have greater flexibility in terms of voluntarily unbundling. That there's quite a bit of parking that is built subterranean in these apartment buildings, and I think certainly there's nothing that prevents property owners of those buildings to where they have unbundled the parking from the unit and it's not attached to it, or it's whatever is part of the lease to a renter to have those spaces be allocated for some other use. That's obviously something we've always encouraged in terms of helping people manage their parking resources. But I think the issue with some of the older properties is probably a little tricky, because it's perhaps tied to a unit or what have you, and
it's tied to the lease.
Yeah, exactly. So that could be quite challenging.
No, it's not tied to a lease on a new lease.
No, in a rent-controlled unit.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't saying that you'd be taking someone's parking space away. I'm just saying for an available parking space, that is potentially an opportunity for somebody to charge their vehicle there, or for multiple people to charge their vehicle there.
Right. Yeah.
And it avoids some of the curbside issues that
Sure.
that go along with the strategy of, and it could be something that's potentially a public-private partnership where there is some arrangement between the city and a property owner.
Yeah. There's a company that we met. They're called PowerTree. They're based in San Francisco, and their business model is to rent the roof from the property owner, put solar on it, rent a parking spot from the owner, put a charger in it. They will sell the solar power back to the tenant or anyone who wants to buy it from them. It could also be the utility that they sell the power back to. But then they allow any kind of network subscriber to access the charging spot, and you have to be a PowerTree user. And so, that kind of system works well for them if they have this mesh network of places you can access, right? They've been looking at trying to come down into the Southern California area. I think it's challenging when you want to try and be as efficient as possible. So if they can talk to one management company and hit 10 different buildings, that would be ideal. But here in Santa Monica, I mean, we have NMS, we have Community Corp, and then it's a whole bunch of other individual property owners, right? And then the other thing I would think about also is like you have a situation where it's almost like affordable housing. If you have this kind of short-term lease parking where you're charging your vehicle, then you're taking, much needed parking off the market that people actually need to park their vehicles.
Right, and that compares to charging on the street. So I would just encourage I would encourage the plan to include within the potential strategies ways of figuring out how to charge not just to charge on private property instead of on the street, and thinking of different ways of achieving that.
Absolutely.
It's like Airbnb for chargers.
There's an app called Pavement, and people who have a charger can, find someone who's willing to share their charger.
Yeah. Commissioner McKinnon.
So we've got 1,400 cars that are EVs in Santa Monica at the moment. What percentage of the total is that? Are there 50,000 or 60,000 cars in Santa Monica?
It's just under 5%.
Right. So what's your goal? How many EV cars do you want to see in Santa Monica in, say, 5 years and then 10 years?
Yeah. Well, we're hoping to achieve at least 15% EVs by 2025, which would be in line with what the state is hoping for in terms of its vehicle sales. So we think that will ultimately translate into ownership, and that's kind of what our target is here.
So you want to triple the number of cars in 10 years?
Correct.
And how will we know whether the plan has worked? What measurements have you got in place to tell us that at every point along the way?
Sure. So some of the data that we started off with when in this presentation is registration, vehicle registration. So we're able to get DMV data for people who register their vehicles to Santa Monica address, and we can see whether they're a battery electric, a hybrid electric, or even a neighborhood electric vehicle. So we can watch the uptake in that. And then we can also pull data from people who pull permits to install EV chargers. So we've done that spatial analysis to see where people are installing those chargers. And we can hopefully point to, let's say, our local rebate program and look at the uptake there. And then once we move to smart chargers, then we can look at the utilization and the utilization over time and the number of users who are using over time. And hopefully what we'll see is people will be using, will have more charging sessions throughout the day for lesser periods of time because they're getting what they need more frequently and not having to wait till they're on their 5% bar to charge up and stay for 4 hours.
So it seemed to me from the users group that was here that one of their arguments, along with the people who've just got cars, is that it's quite impractical at the moment, and that if there were hundreds of more opportunities, that people would purchase and use EV vehicles in greater numbers, but people are worried about running out of juice.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
So are we perhaps not a little slow in incentivizing the installation of these chargers?
Yes, we are.
Well, so you've brought a plan to us that's going to be slow in doing that.
So the plan...
I mean, I can't actually judge it because we didn't have the plan here.
Sure.
And I'd have to say the map that was supplied
Yeah.
is the most single testing piece of literature that was ever been sent to a planning commission. I cannot work out where and on what street you are putting anything. So I feel as if we're operating in the blind here tonight.
Sure.
It wasn't just your eyes, Mario. No, you're exactly right.
So the plan includes a wide variety of stuff. You know, it's projects, it's policy, it's programs, and it's pilots. So we hope once council adopts the omnibus of the plan, that we'll be able to move forth on some of our near-term stuff. You know, we're going to have to start identifying the appropriate locations and start developing these new sites for installations. That's going to take some time. But we can start to develop right away an incentive program that doesn't take a lot of time. So there are going to be things that are going to happen sooner than later when it comes to infrastructure, incentives, and resources. And again, the other thing to point out is that, you know, our work is not isolated. There's lots of other incentives coming from the California Energy Commission, from the Air Resources Board, from the Air Quality Management District, from our utility. So they're all very invested and going to be investing significantly in vehicle electrification. And part of our work is to help bring that to the people, to make sure that they know that those resources are available, they know how to access them. And some of that is very much available today.
So in looking at the map, the ownership is highest in the R1 districts, as you'd expect. They're the people that can afford $350, or there's a place up on 26th Street where the homeowner's got 2 of these chargers in his front area. And yet it doesn't seem that you have concentrated the new charging in the multifamily districts in a way which would incentivize people just to buy an EV and take the risk going forward. Why is that?
Well, part of our calculus is, again, where we think we can get a charger in, and then sometimes it's not really based on where we want it. some of the reason why the dots are so vague is because we don't necessarily want to give people hope that like, oh, that's right in front of my property. I'm going to have a charger pretty soon, because we're going to evaluate it, and it may not actually be that where we want it to be. We might have to put it down over there or down over here, and then we might figure out, well, it's going to cost us $30,000 to do the whole thing, and then we might write it off. So part of that is we have to do a site assessment for each site before we actually install these things.
So I'd like to take up the point that Commissioner Parry was driving towards, which is, I can't tell from the map, but what about many of the supermarket lots that we have in Santa Monica? And second, you did say that the residential ownership is curtailed, but commercial ownership of vast parking lots in Santa Monica is concentrated in 2 or 3 hands. And for example, the Yahoo Centre or the Water Garden down there could easily be suppliers, just as we can write into the DA that's coming to us for St John's. We've got UCLA Hospital. There are these vast areas that we could look at, if nothing else incentivising, in putting in EV chargers.
Absolutely.
But you didn't seem to allude to that, and you didn't answer that question for Commissioner Parry in that way.
Okay, sure. So we have thought a lot about these large opportunity sites. One of the ones that I keep looking at is the Gelson's lot at Lincoln and Ocean Park. Whole Foods is one of the few who have gone out of their way to put EV charging for their customers, and it serves their market base. The model that is serving that is a free model. The company Volta.
Well, it's not really. You've got to buy at the shop, and that's not a cheap option.
No. But the model is the company rents the parking spot. They pay for the electricity, but you have a tiny billboard, or 6-foot billboard in front of the parking spot that's helping supplement the cost of the charging and the infrastructure. So that's a relationship, and that's a decision that Whole Foods has made to provide for its customers. I think what we are trying to be careful with is who we incentivize and how we incentivize. Again, this model is available for any commercial property that wants to provide charging for its customers or its employees. And we're really looking to serve people who are less resourced. That said, I think, and we have reached out to these opportunity sites to look at, to ask them, have you thought about charging? What's your misgivings? And we want to work with them to see if charging is something that they're willing to do.
Can I ask you, I don't quite understand that, because surely from what you were saying, you're trying to get EVs into everyone's hands as fast as possible. Now, we all have to visit the supermarket. Wouldn't that be a good place to encourage people to get EVs, because then they'll be ready charging? Does it really matter who supplies the charging?
No.
Can I clarify though? Because what I hear you saying is a hesitancy to provide some kind of financial incentive.
Correct.
Right? Because I think in some ways then it seems like we're promoting that business.
Yeah, but at the moment we've got a free model, and we're saying we're going to a charge model. So that should make sense, that you encourage supermarkets to put something in place. Like, this plan is not just about us providing chargers out there, it's about encouraging the spread of EVs in the city of Santa Monica, is it not?
Can I clarify again? What do you mean by encourage?
Well,
like, what would be the action to encourage?
Oh, well, the spread of charges both on private and public property, which would then encourage people to switch cars out of gasoline power into electric power.
No, I guess I'm saying, what's the incentive to, like, when you say we want to encourage those commercial businesses to provide the charger, like a financial incentive, or like what's the tool for encouraging that you're thinking of?
Well, I'm uncertain about that.
Okay, sorry.
And I'm really asking the question of you, is it in the plan? And if not, why isn't it in the plan?
Yeah. So we do focus on, we do have this multi-unit dwellings and workplaces, so that's something that we've want to cover. I guess what my personal hesitance was again providing sorry, let me back up. When somebody puts an EV charger in a retail destination, there's longer dwell time. People make money off of that. That's proven. And so the city, whether or not the city should be doing that for businesses, I guess I was concerned about the optics of that. We can give $10,000 to the folks who own the Gelson Center and the folks who own the Yahoo Center, and say put in a charger. But I don't know if the optics of that would.
I'm not actually saying that. I'm actually asking the question: are you encouraging Gelsons and Vons and the others to go ahead and put their own chargers in place as you run this program out?
Right. Yes, we would be.
You would be, or you are?
Well, we haven't started yet. I mean, in terms of our research for putting this together, we've reached out to most of those property owners, and some of those have said like, well, I've got to talk to corporate first. And what we're trying to do is identify what is the pain point for some of these people. Why hasn't this happened yet? Maybe they don't know about it. Maybe it's this decision that has to come from corporate. Maybe they're concerned about the parking availability that's already limited, and they can't put their, they don't want to dedicate more spaces. We reached out to Bob's Market. Bob's Market, as you may know, doesn't have parking for its employees. They have a high volume of turnout, but it's a very popular destination, but they don't want to have charging. So our incentive is going to have to be different for that location. So it's going to have to be more.
So I do understand that. That goes back to my original question. How do we measure the success of the plan, and what is in fact your objective? Is it to put in charges, or is it to get people switched over? I mean, in some ways I see this as a transitional technology, because it's still a single vehicle moving around. It's not going to fix our congestion or our traffic problems.
Right.
How does this play with autonomous vehicles?
Hopefully we will be in a future where autonomous vehicles find their own place to charge. But again...
What, outside the city of Santa Monica?
I guess so.
Well, no, but where do you expect them to charge? We're going to have autonomous vehicles within 3 to 5 years. The Tesla might be one of them. Where do you think they'll charge?
Well, someone's going to have to be standing there ready to plug them in. Because we're still going to be, saddled with corded chargers for the time being.
Right.
So... we haven't really looked at that. I think that's something that we're looking at a broader view through like our climate action plan, which does have a longer view in terms of the policies and programs that we'd like to pursue. This EV plan is really about the infrastructure, and when AV becomes an issue to deal with, I think that we'll address it then. But currently we're behind on the issue of EV. So I think that's kind of where our focus is right now.
And when the plan comes back, will it have all of these numbers and bits and pieces and strategies all encompassed in that?
Well, they're presented here before you now, and they're mostly final form. What we talk about in the actual plan is a lot more justification, a lot more context, a lot more case studies. But basically what we've talked about tonight is essentially the gist of the plan.
So the plan is written. We could have seen it. You just sent us this shortened report.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I guess I just wanted to. It sounds like I'm curious about the locations of the proposed chargers. I think it's great that we have this focus on trying to create more access for people who live in multifamily buildings, right? Because it's definitely a hindrance. I just bought a car, and my husband and I looked at each other and we said, should we get an electric vehicle? We said, no siree, there's no place to charge it, right? So I felt that in a very real way. So the emphasis on trying to expand access for people who are living in apartment buildings is great. Garrett, but I kind of hear you saying that it was like it was very much technical criteria that you used. I mean, is that true, or were there considerations around other types of goals?
So our first filter was to focus in the multifamily neighborhood.
Okay.
Our second filter was to look at where there was Chevron parking or head-ins parking, so we can serve multiple spaces. And then our third consideration was to look at streetlights. So going through those filters, that's kind of how we arrived at those locations. It very well may be that there are other locations that are better suited based off of the available electricity. Unfortunately, it's kind of a chicken and an egg decision between us and Edison. They don't look at it and tell us that it's feasible or tell us what we need to put there until we ask, I want to put something here. And then, so unfortunately, we won't know that any of these locations are viable or not viable until we start going down that process of engineering and design. But that's, again, based off of kind of our cursory overview, looking at maps and looking at what's on the street already.
And I totally appreciate the blobbiness of the locations, but it'll be great when you can read the street names, as Commissioner McKinnon pointed out. So I'm a little unclear about where some of this is. But what about neighborhood versus like Pico Boulevard, more commercial streets? Are there trade-offs between locating in really in a residential neighborhood versus on like a commercial district?
Sure. Well, commercial district, if it's, typically there's, you have your commercial district and then you have like your density, your dense residential and then like your less dense residential kind of adjacent. If you're located actually more in the commercial district, you're going to see a wide variety of uses. So people will be coming for the retail in the daytime, and then towards the end of the day, you'll be seeing people charging from home or home charging at those locations. If it's located exclusively in the residential district, I mean, you can expect that people will be charging mostly when they're at home, when their vehicles parked there throughout the day. Or if there are people who are, going to nearby parks and things like that.
So what I'm hearing you say is that there's likely to be more users if it's in a more public location than in a...
Yes, that's probably the case, but you'll probably, the dwell time would probably be more limited because a lot of our locations in those commercial districts are limited to like 2 hours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the residential, there's not a lot of, the time restrictions are a little bit more loose.
How do you limit them to 2 hours? It just says you're limited to 2 hours.
Well, even though EVs can park at the meter for free, they still have to comport to what the posted signage is.
That's right. I see what you're saying. The challenge around having to pay for parking when you go right to the beach lot or something like that, is there a way to address that? Because obviously that's a hurdle to public access when you have to pay for it.
Right. I mean, we're talking about 2 different systems. One is our parking system, and then one is our charging system. Mm-hmm. So we would have to, if we're going down that path, we would have to figure out some way to make sure that someone who is given a resident parking card to park in the beach lot, let's say, has some kind of ability to wave through the arm. Mm-hmm. And I think that could create a lot of issues when that card gets passed around and people are using that card not just to charge, but to, visit the beach parking lot anytime. It could be that, maybe that facility, because there is a cost to park, that maybe the cost of charging is, lowered or less or free. Mm-hmm. So that would be the alternative incentive.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's logistically challenging, but until we have more charging locations, it's probably something that it'd be worth putting some effort into. So.
Sure.
I guess I just want to clarify that you came to us tonight to answer our questions and to just get the general feedback. You're not looking for any kind of specific recommendation or...
Not tonight.
Okay.
Tonight we're just talking about the concepts and the strategies and to get your feedback and to have you hear from the community as well. Like I said, we'll be releasing a public version of the plan itself. We'll try to incorporate as many of these ideas as possible. And then we hope to come back probably in September, perhaps, with the full plan for your review. And then hopefully by October, we'll go to council for adoption.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Yeah, I have one last question. First of all, let me say I think the plan is great, and I think it's appropriately blobby at this point because it is a moving target. No one knows where the technology is. We don't even know where the 16 kV is coming in our city. There's too many moving parts for anyone to have other than a blobby plan. But do I understand correctly that you're proposing that in new residential buildings, multifamily, that we provide one charging point for every unit, whether they have one car or two car, car and a half, whatever. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we've started going down that road in some DAs where we ask people to up that. And we get a lot of moaning and groaning about how big the transformer room has to be. And is there any truth to that?
Yes.
Okay. So if you're designing a building that's going to accommodate 100, 200 parking spots. But remember, we're still flying with that duck, and at night there's supposed to be no demand, so that's when presumably all this power that was being used for air conditioning would now be charging cars. So I'm saying,
yeah, unfortunately, it's not like a zero-sum game when it comes to electricity, because we're designing for maximum usage when it comes to electricity. Right. You're designing to anticipate everyone plugging in at the same time, everyone turning on everything at the same time, right? Because that's what the utility is there for. They're there to be reliable, which means that you expect everything to turn on whenever you want it.
But part of the technology is supposed to be smart. So were that to happen, what would happen is obviously the lights would stay on, but people would be charging slower, and as more and more people turn off their lights, they would amp up, and eventually they would be back to full charge. But the point I'm making then, hypothetically, would let's say in an ideal universe, what everybody has in a new building, their one spot that they're charging, and they're still maybe taking advantage of charging at work or somewhere else. But would the transformer room double in size? Would it increase by 50%? In other words, what's the real penalty here? Because that's the only objection that I feel. Running some conduit is very inexpensive. It's that same $300 that you would do at quote-unquote a single-family residence. But somehow the big penalty has been represented to us is the transformer room. And so what is the penalty?
Right. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but this recommendation is kind of coming on the heels of what San Francisco has adopted as a policy for new construction. And they're recommending something more extreme, 100% of all spaces EV ready. And so they've done that analysis by comparing new construction, adequately preparing for all of your EV spaces during the time of new construction, rather than retrofitting your building to accommodate the demand that you didn't anticipate before. And so by that token, they do see that building up front is more cost effective, obviously, than retrofitting. We can take a look at that penalty of the increased electrical demand or the electrical infrastructure that's required. But that's the kind of comparison that we're talking about is really what it is up front versus what is it afterwards. It's an afterthought. Right. I don't necessarily agree with the 100% EV ready prescription because we're not there yet, clearly, and even over time, the technology in the vehicles will change where the range will be much longer, and you're not going to have to always be right next to a charging location. So I do think there is some sunk cost with that kind of proposal, but with the transformer, we haven't looked at it yet.
Okay, maybe you can look into that.
Sure.
I don't think we should use that as a barrier to diffusion, but we do need to put out all these little brush fires that are raising up in opposition. Thank you.
Commissioner Lambert.
I just can't resist. I think 100% is pretty excessive myself. And I think that when we think about that sort of thing, we have to think about what kind of cost we're putting on the production of housing, because that sort of seemed to have been a not particularly well thought out, not that, but just in general, that we may not see any housing anyway, so it's going to be moot.
Commissioner McKinnon.
What is the leading city or town for EV penetration and rates of EV infrastructure in America?
So some of the cities that we've looked to and modeled a lot of our policy and ideas off of are a lot of northwestern cities. So Vancouver, Seattle, San Francisco. Sacramento is kind of coming out as a actually interesting city for EVs. They were recently awarded the Green City designation through VW's electrification program. But this is based off the fact that they feel like there's a greater market gap to overcome. So that's why they chose Sacramento over a city like Los Angeles, city of San Jose as well.
Great. Thank you, Garrett, so much. We appreciate your expertise and educating us on the EVs.
Thank you.
We'll see you in a couple months.
So do we make comments or just let it go, or what happens now?
Oh, I thought that was the. I apologize. Do you have feedback?
Well, the most striking thing was the point that I was trying to get to, that when we look at the maps of the ownership is in these single-family dwellings, and yet where we really want to penetrate is people who are thinking about EV cars but are finding it difficult because of the infrastructure itself. The classic argument is what comes first. Well, if you're thinking about a car, everybody's doing what you're doing. There's nowhere to charge. I'm going to spend all my night at Virginia Park at 2 a.m, and then the cops are going to come. This is a real disincentive. So you need to take that into account. I do think the supermarkets and other places, the private providers, somehow in this plan, you need to have a strain which makes them go, let's get with the program here. Whatever we do, we have to be working in sync. And if you seriously want to make this transition out of the automobile as we've got it into a new future, then this is the moment. And you have to seize that moment. And so you've only got a couple of months to do it. And I was a little unconvinced from what I saw in this document and from what you were saying to me that you had completely seized that moment. And so I'm hoping that you're going to do that. I know it won't address our traffic or congestion problems. The mobility stream that we're all working on very shortly is going to do that, but I think it's a really important thing to do. And I also would like to figure out who are the leaders, how far are we away from leading, what's it going to take, and how will we know that we're on the right path? Or will you come back in a year's time and say, well, there are 400 more vehicles, we seem to be doing the right thing. Those things I think are really critical to this plan. Other than that, I think you're on the right track. So thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner McKinnon. Any other feedback? I didn't mean to cut things short. Okay, great. Thank you. Future commission agenda items. Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Well, I'll bring up what I brought up last time, which is the need for us to discuss a really good seismic ordinance and put that up farther up on the food chain than it's been in the past. So when would you like to schedule it?
I thought we had a seismic ordinance. I thought building commission
we
did
do
that.
have, but I have some ideas for enhancing it and making it more effective.
Is that within our sphere?
Obviously.
I don't know.
It's it's the number one goal, public safety. That's why we're here.
Staff, is that?
It goes on the list, I believe.
Well, we could certainly have someone from Building Safety come and talk about the existing seismic ordinance, and then if you have recommendations, that really needs to kind of come through council if you're directing additional work. But I think we could start with the presentation, and then again, if you wanted to try to have some changes to that, then you could talk to council people about prioritizing that.
Well, that's what I'd like to do, but I'd like to get some consensus from the Planning Commission on the direction, because our job is to advise council. If they choose then not to act on it, that's a possibility, but I have a feeling that they may be willing to act on it, and therefore we would be doing our proper role as advising them.
Right. So I think starting with a presentation on what the existing ordinance is would be the first step.
Great.
Okay.
Commissioner Lambert, do you have a?
No.
Okay. Commissioner Fresco?
Now that the DCP is off our list, I just wanted to remind y'all that we were going to talk about perhaps a planning commission retreat where we can all get to know each other and hug and talk about planning.
All together?
Yes.
That might be a mixed blessing, Commissioner. Yes, already, Commissioner Lambert, yes.
Can we pause for a second? I mean, is there precedence for that? Is there funding for that? What is staff's thought?
No, I think actually that would be really good. Sometime in the fall, perhaps, and we could think about logistics, how it gets paid for, that kind of stuff.
Okay. So. Commissioner.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, that's because they've got Commissioner Rosenbaum. Yeah.
Commissioner McKinney, you don't have, okay. All right. Written communication, receive the planning commission case lists and the development projects. No public input.
Actually, I have a question about that. And I brought it up last time, the pipeline. I am mightily confused. From what I remember you're saying about the DCP, there are 4 projects in the pipeline that do not have entitlements but are vested under the DCP, correct? And so all those that are on the pipeline that are neither that nor already entitled are just sort of hanging in the ether, right? And they may come back or they may not. But they would have to comply with the DCP if they did.
That's correct. Yeah, the vast majority of the ones that are in that realm are actually development agreements.
Right.
So we anticipate, obviously with the new, if the plan is approved with the streamlined approval process, they would refile with a new application under the new rules.
Like the inclusionary rules, if that happens.
So yeah,
right?
so we have, but yeah, you are correct that at this moment in time we have 4 projects that, of which the plan does not apply to them because they, meet the.
Oh, so they're not right. Okay, yeah. They're like the previous.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
They were adjourned. Thank you.